Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Omar Dawahere, and I'm the Assistant Director at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU. On behalf of our director, Jill Lane, our staff, faculty, and students, I welcome you to our presentation of Liminal Spaces, Migration, and Women of the Guyanese Diaspora. And I also want to welcome our participants, Grace Aneiza Ali, Aisha Khan, Maria del Pilar Kaladeen, Mackrandilal, and Suchitra Mattai. I also want to acknowledge and thank for their support our co-sponsors at the Asian Pacific American Institute and the Institute for African American Affairs and the Center for Black Visual Culture, both at NYU. First, I want to congratulate Grace and the contributors of this book for making it accessible in digital form. Being from the Caribbean, born in Puerto Rico, of a Boricua mother and a Dominican father with roots in the Middle East, I carry that Antillania or Antillean worldview living in the diaspora. Being now in New York, a Caribbean city, I always find so many common threads with people I meet from all over the region in our experiences and worldviews, and yet there is so much more to learn from our individual perspectives. Being able to read from your writings, see through images in the book, and hear from your experiences today as artists and authors weaving through history and personal realities is a privilege. And I want to thank you for sharing that and joining us. Now, it is my honor to present and pass the virtual spotlight to the moderator of today's presentation, a great colleague, mentor, and friend from the CLACS faculty, Professor Aisha Khan. Aisha is Associate Professor of Anthropology at NYU, and among her publications are the books Kalaloo Nation, Metaphors of Race and Religion, Identity Among South Asians in Trinidad, Islam and the Americas, and The Deepest Dive, Obeya, Jose, and Race in the Atlantic World. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Omar, for that gracious introduction. I am very pleased to be here, and I want to thank all the folks at CLACS who've made this possible and all the other centers. I also want to acknowledge the indigenous land that NYU and CLACS is located on now, and also proceed to our wonderful event this evening. I'm delighted to be invited to be a part of the celebration of a wonderful new anthology called Liminal Spaces, Migration and Women of the Guyanese Diaspora, edited by Grace Aneiza Ali. And we are also graced to have three contributors to the volume besides Grace's own work. So I just want to quickly introduce them to you, and then I will say just a very few remarks because we have a full program of four really wonderful artists and scholars to hear from. And then in the last half hour or so, we will open up our virtual reality to your questions for the panelists. But for now, let me tell you that Grace Aneiza Ali is not only the editor of Liminal Spaces, but she's assistant professor and provost fellow at the Department of Art and Public Policy at our very own Tisch School of the Arts here at NYU. And we also are very pleased to have Suchitra Mattai, who is a multidisciplinary artist currently residing in Denver. And we also want to welcome Maria del Pilar Kaladeen, who is an academic specializing in Caribbean indenture and who is at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the University of London. And Maria is joining us very, very late, so we're especially proud to be able to say she's awake. I don't know that I would be at this hour for her. And last but certainly not least, we're delighted to welcome Mackrandilal, who is also a multidisciplinary artist and writer and arts administrator who currently resides in Los Angeles, California. So welcome to you all. I'm very excited, and I'm going to just have a few comments as a kind of let's call it the warm-up act before we get to the real reason everybody's here. Now, in this anthology, Liminal Spaces, Migration and Women of the Guyanese Diaspora, Grace quotes from Patricia Engel's memoir, It's Not Love, It's Just Paris. Now, Engels says, and I quote, all immigrants are artists because they create a life, a future from nothing but a dream. The immigrant's life is art in its purest form, end quote. It seems to me that we think of immigrants as constituting diasporas, another kind of poetry in motion perhaps, precisely because they spend a lifetime in rebuilding activities, rebuilding their own lives so that the next generations can better build theirs. This process of rebuilding pushes us to think what it means to be settled. Perhaps settled is just the slowed down or routinized part of rebuilding. We can think of motherland as the place or places where one is left, and homeland as the place or places where one has settled. But settled is not stasis. This is evident particularly in the continuous rebuilding activity that immigrants undertake, including, of course, the contributors to Grace Ali's beautiful anthology. 15 Guyanese women who are artists, activists, scholars, teachers, poets, performers, journalists, and curators explore the relationship to migration through the literary and visual art forms of memoir, creative nonfiction, poetry, photography, and curatorial and art essays. All of these efforts comprise a first of its kind anthology, which adds to the excitement of Liminal Spaces. As if it weren't wonderful enough in itself, it is a first of a kind anthology in which the contributors bear witness to what drives Guyanese women from their homeland and what keeps them moored in place for the last 7 decades of Guyanese history. For me, among the most interesting dimensions of diaspora, which is captured so well in this anthology, is the myriad ways that people connect to the place that they have left behind or feel that they have left behind, even when they've never been there. Salman Rushdie long ago wrote about Indias of the mind, as he put it, in talking about South Asian diasporas. In the work of the contributors, 4 of whom we see today, to Liminal Spaces, we see just how many ways Guyanas of the mind define diaspora's liminal spaces as Grace characterizes the caught between 2 worlds experience of emigration from here to there. And as this anthology excavates the dignity and the beauty that is all too often missed or denied in migrant women's experience. As with the mid-19th to early 20th century women who became coolies, as they were called, upon signing indentured labor contracts in India and sailing alone very often to British colonies to assume work on sugar plantations, many Windrush generation women of the post-war period, another rebuilding on the part of the British state, as well as the immigrants who came to do the labor. These Windrush generation women also sailed alone in many cases to Britain from British West Indian colonies, notably Jamaica, but also Guyana and Trinidad. And today, of course, women immigrate to North America and the North Atlantic on their own, as well as with others, carrying on what I think might be thought of as a grand tradition of elegant pragmatism, where life imitates art. There is so much more to be said about liminal spaces. So I will now turn to Grace and Maya and Maria and Suchitra to share with us their thoughts about their work and about diaspora and about Guyana. And then, as I mentioned, for the last half hour or so, we will be opening up to your questions for the panelists. Thank you very much, and take it away, Grace.
Oh my goodness, Aisha, can I take you on the road with us?
I go anywhere. I will go anywhere.
That was the most beautiful, thoughtful, generous introduction. And, you know, for us, if I may speak for Maya, Suchitra, and Maria for a moment, for us who've poured over this project, to have someone capture the scope of it with such beauty and such beautiful language, the Guyanas of the mind. Wow. I'm going to ask you for the text of those remarks if it's so beautiful.
Absolutely. You only are as good as what you have to work with. So right back at you.
And it's an absolute joy to be in conversation with you. I couldn't imagine a better person to have this opening talk with the Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies with. So thank you for your time and for being here with us. I'm going to ask my fellow friends and colleagues to use a little bit of my time just to thank some incredible people and departments at NYU who are responsible for us being here. Of course, Omar and the team, Joanna at the Center for Latin American Studies, thank you always for being so enthusiastic whenever I bring up Guyana to your programming. I appreciate that so much. Our co-sponsor, the Asian Pacific American Institute, and also the Center for Black Visual Culture. Thank you so much, Joan Morgan. And a very special thank you, because I know she's watching, she's in the Zoom room, Dr. Deborah Willis, who was so enthusiastic to support our talk tonight. And I've also minted Dr. Willis an honorary Guyanese. I don't have that power, but I took it on anyways, because she, over the last few years, has always been such a champion for Guyanese artists and Guyanese art. And so she's an honorary Guyanese. And of course, my academic home, Art and Public Policy. I know Kathy Engel is in the room, and our chair, Pato Hebert. So thank you all so much. I also want our audience to know that our conversation this evening with Maya, Suchitra, and Maria is about a particular narrative in the book, which is looking at the art of indenture and the Indian migration, Indo-Guyanese migration narratives within the book. But the book is so sweeping in its scope as a whole. It's 15 women of Guyanese heritage. And so in the chat, I am putting a link where you can see all of the amazing contributors and also join us for future events where so many of our other contributors will be speaking about the book. So I just wanted to acknowledge that this is a gathering of more than us and some incredible, poignant, brilliant voices and essays. Omar, if you can go to my first page. And what you all will see, not that we didn't want to do the work of a PowerPoint, but the book is open access. And so I think Omar can put a link in the chat. So you're able to read the open access version of the book, both the PDF and the HTML. So we just thought we would show you the whole kitchen sink and show you the pages of the book as we go through. So I wanted to spend my time talking about this idea of the things we carry. And this question of how can the things we carry across borders map the emotional terrain of migration. And I wanted to start out with this photograph it's a photograph from the 1970s of my mom, who's in the center in that pink floral dress. And she's at the airport, Tamiri International Airport in Guyana, saying goodbye to her sister as her sister would leave for Barbados and then later on migrate to Canada. And I actually start the introduction of the book, grounding the book in this photograph, because it really reflects how airports as a site itself became really integral to many Guyanese people, as Guyanese people have long known migration as probably, I would argue, one of the single most defining narratives of our country. And just a little bit of data, over 1 million Guyanese people live in diasporic cities like London, Toronto, New York City, where we are the 5th largest immigrant community. A lot of people don't know that. We're small but mighty. And that's a staggering data because there are over 1 million of us in the diaspora, but the country is actually quite small. There's only 787,000 people in the country itself. So you actually have this incredible unique thing where more people, more Guyanese people live outside of the country than live within it. And so I wanted to read a short paragraph from the introduction talking about the importance of this photograph. And it's from the introduction. Making the journey with my family when we left was a handful of photographs. For many families like mine who were poor with few possessions, owning photographs was a privilege. They were among our most valuable things. We had no negatives, no JPEGs, no double copies, just originals. Decades later, these photographs serve as a tangible connection to a homeland left behind. This family photograph, taken at Guyana's Timehri International Airport, captures a moment in time between concluding an old life and preparing for a new one. The photograph reveals movement and transition as the constants in our lives, where airports often served as sites for family reunions. Before I too boarded my first plane at age 14 to depart Guyana on a one-way flight bound for JFK, I had long resented planes as the violent machines that fragmented families and broke friendships. And I also opened the book with this photograph of my mom who's watching, and and I think Maya, Maria, and Suchitra might know I might get in trouble for putting my mother's photograph in a book. So I'll probably hear about it later. But this photograph speaks to something else that's another part of the book, and that is because my mother had to show up to this airport so many times to watch so many of her loved ones, all of her siblings, leave Guyana, and she was the one left behind. That took its toll, and I think an important thing that we don't talk about when we talk about migration is that it's a two-way street. They're the ones who leave and the ones who are left. And so much of the migration narratives are focused on the ones who leave and not on the ones who are left. And I see this photograph and I often really think about my mother showing up at this airport multiple times and having to watch the people she loves leave. And the second thing I'll share, the second object I'll share, and I'll end with this object. And we can go to the next page, Omar. Thank you. So in my chapter in the geography of separation, I continue talking about the things that we carry. And in this instance, in addition to the handful of photographs, we carried this karahi, this large, thick, circular, deep cooking pot that many of you might know, both here and in the audience, that was first introduced to Guyana by Indian indentured servants under the British system of indentureship. And so this karahi, this big pot, is still very used in everyday life in Guyana. Well, we figured out how to bring this big pot in the suitcases. And it really becomes another object that speaks to this idea of what are the things that really narrate our migration story. And I'll read a short part about this karahi, and I'll end there. Our karahi, aged, scratched, chipped, nicked, scraped, and blackened, had hit its sweet spot. Over decades, it had absorbed into its pores the perfect medley of oils and spices, which it now infused into whatever meats and vegetables and sauces were poured into it. My mother had grown up as a young girl watching her mother cook for her family in the same karahi. Daily, it produced curries or stews or occasional chow mein or fried rice for my mother and all of her siblings. In her suitcase, bound for America, there was no prized jewelry, no priceless antiques, no precious silk saris. There was only the karahi, the sole possession she had after her mother died. It was not going to be left behind. It was coming to America with us. Now, 25 years later, it is the object that bridges my mother's past with her present, her homeland with her new land, her mother with her daughters. After all these years, it survives. It is now over 60 years old. Oceans and lands apart from its origin, the karahi continues to nourish my family. My mother still cooks her curries and stews in that karahi in her American home. She is among the many daughters who carry their mother's things across borders. Thank you. And now I'd love to introduce to you my friend and amazing artist, Suchitra Mattai.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you for that. I too have a karahi, so I just wanted to add that. I'm going to start. Well, thank you all for having me here. I wanted to start by just reading the page in Grace's lovely book on my chapter, which is called Revisionist. And then I will make some comments after. So, I left Guyana in 1977 when I was 3 years old, but Guyana has never left me. Through family narratives, memories, and photographs, I have always been reminded of my homeland, yet simultaneously alienated from it. My family's migratory path from Guyana to Canada to the United States never led to a place of connection for me. I have always felt othered in so many ways. As a result, my life has been directed by a continual search for an imagined home. Making our journey first to Nova Scotia, Canada, and eventually to various areas of the United States, I patiently waited to find a place that felt right. In my 20s, I traveled to India, looking to the motherland, I guess, as my original homeland. On my first flight there, I looked through the window as the plane landed in Delhi and was overcome with an inexplicable familiarity. But as I traveled throughout India, unable to communicate with ease, I quickly realized that this was not the right place either. I would have to continue to look elsewhere. My family, who first came as Indian indentured servants to British Guyana, is part of a history of ocean voyages to foreign lands by means of contracts of bondage. And so, as an artist, much of my practice is driven by this idea of an invented, idealized homeland. My artwork is characterized by disconnected landscapes. They are unreal, but offering a lingering familiarity. These landscapes are created from history, memory, travel, and pop culture. Many of the objects I use in my practice, whether it be embroidery, vintage needlepoints, macrame works, or other craft-based elements, they're all domestic in nature. I think a lot about the home and the objects that occupy the home. They're a nod to my Guyanese grandmothers, aunties, and mother who engaged in practices of embroidery, macrame, crochet, and sewing during my childhood. It was a way for me to connect with my grandmothers. We would sew, and I would also teach my grandmother how to read and write. So that was another aspect of my connection. Thus, my work loosely weaves together a sense of an imagined home. Through each puncture of embroidery, each woven thread, and each painted stroke, I am both bounded by and freed from my past, present, and future homes. So When Grace asked me to be part of this book, I was really touched. And I have to say, as a project, it's really allowed me to find a home. The thought that there are so many creative, wonderful Guyanese women in the diaspora, and that the way Grace has brought us all together really finally provided me with this space of home. And I thought it was perfectly fitting that she put marked my chapter, or put me in the chapter of transitions, because that's what my life has completely been about. In a way, when I think of my artwork, it's really about reconciliation and about fragmentation. And throughout whether it be, I make a lot of different kinds of work. So whether it's painting, installation, video, I'm really interested in this process of bringing together very disparate elements and making them whole, making them belong. There's one page, Omar, with one of my works called Promised Land. I was hoping we could go to. And in this work, not this one, it's yes, that one. So this work is called Promised Land. And, you know, I mentioned I use a lot of domestic objects, found objects, and then sort of, re-envision them, reimagine them. And really, the whole practice, my whole practice is about giving voice to people who didn't have voices before. So for this particular work, I used a found headboard and then video that I had collected actually crossing the Middle Passage on a ship. So what I did was I projected that video into the portal of the headboard. Now the video, because I was on a ship, is very, shaky and uncomfortable, and the portal is very small. And the idea was to provide a space of discomfort so that others could think about what that passage might have been like. Much of the work that's included in Grace's book is of that nature. I wanted to also talk a little bit about some of the materials that I'm using now that really were inspired by the book. So I've been weaving these massive vintage sari tapestries, and the saris are from all over the world. It's important for me for them to be vintage, used, and it's wonderful when I'm weaving them. I actually can, smell the smells of curry, or I smell perfume, and there's a sort of a very emotive sense of being that I have, that I'm connected somehow to all these women. So the saris, they're from India, they're from the Middle East, they're from my own family in New Jersey and friends. And what I'm really thinking about when I weave them is this idea of connecting women of the diaspora over topography and through time. And so I just wanted to add that, because this book, has been a labor of love. And I just want to thank again Grace for including me, and to all the wonderful other contributors. So thank you.
So hi, everyone. Thank you so much to everybody who's joined us. And thank you especially to Aisha and Grace for hosting this event. I was thinking while Suchitra was speaking that I hope I never take for granted having a space like this where people who share your heritage, and where it's so easy to talk and to be yourself. I hope I never really get to a stage where I take that for granted, because it's a special thing. So I'd like to read to you a little bit from my chapter, which is A Daughter's Journey from Indenture to Windrush. And it's funny, you were talking about asking for permission. So I had to ask my dad's permission to use this photo. And he said no. He said, no, you can't have my permission to use that photo. And I said, but it's not the same story without the photo. And I had a long chat with him. Eventually he agreed, but I had a long chat with him because I was interested as to I use this photo a lot in my work now with his permission. But I was interested as to why he didn't want me to use it. And he said, because I don't look like that anymore. And I think there's also an element for me that my dad, I don't think my dad realized in any sense the dreams that he had for himself. And I think that for me looking at this picture as his daughter, I feel so proud. I think he was so handsome. I think he was such a handsome guy. And I think he was also very brave. He was the first in his family to leave Guyana. And so what we see when we look at the photo are two different things. And I think my vision of him won him over in the end. So it's lovely that it's here, and it's lovely that he agreed to finally to have it in the book. I grew up knowing nothing about the history or culture of my father. Courtesy of the British Empire, I am the byproduct of two imperial migrations. The migration of my great-grandparents from India to Guyana in the latter part of the 19th century, and the migration of my father, Paul, from British Guyana to the United Kingdom in 1961. Paul was part of what later became known in Britain as the Windrush generation. The first of his four siblings to leave Guyana, he was also the only one who chose to come to the United Kingdom. He left British Guyana's capital, Georgetown, by boat. Accompanying him were a childhood friend and two other young men who all shared a cabin in a 3-week journey to Plymouth in southwest England. My father had hoped to see the world, yet within 4 years he had permanently settled in London. In his third year in the city, he met a woman from the northeast of Spain who had also made her home in London. Within a year, they had married. A procession of babies, of which I was the last, terminated any ambitions either of them may have had for themselves. My parents' attitude towards who their children should be in a country to which they had both migrated inadvertently rendered me a cultural orphan. I have always felt that I was left unarmed in a society that did not accept me. As an undergraduate, I discovered a small section in the university library on Caribbean literature. It included novels and works of poetry by Indian Caribbean writers. From these books, I learned that I was part of a community, and by reading as much as I could, I slowly absorbed the story of indenture in the Caribbean and began a journey that continues to this day. Two things have shaped the direction of my adult life: my father's silence about his ancestry and the racism that my brothers and I experienced as children of Guyanese Spanish heritage growing up in West London in the 70s and 80s. This was a time when every institution that carried authority attempted to convince immigrant parents that a sense of cultural identity was an obstacle rather than a lifeline and a necessity. You were born here, my parents would say. You're British. I remember these years as being darkly lit, gloomy. The prevailing attitude of this time in Britain was a bleak one, where racism was an everyday experience. For much of my early life, I struggled to understand my father's heritage. As a child, I knew that the part of me that was most hated in the place I called home came from him. This never changed the love I had for him. To the contrary, I clung to my connection to his identity as a constant, solid thing because I believed I had nothing else. In these circumstances, all I could be was my father's daughter. Yet everything I knew about his background was fragmentary. He was from a country called Guyana. It used to be a British colony. Inexplicably, he was both Indian and South American. And this meant that the children who pelted racist words at us in the streets were essentially correct. Correct in the sense that the words they used were words used in the UK as derogatory terms for anyone of South Asian origin. One night, some neighborhood children threw dog shit against the window of the room that I was sleeping in. This is one of my earliest memories. They had wrapped it in pink toilet paper, and some of the paper stuck to the window. There was no joy in the fact that they were forced, either by the police or their parents, to clean it up the following day. They lived on that street, and so did we. And for the foreseeable future, we would have to see them every day.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Suchitra, for sharing. I want to thank Grace for bringing us together, and to NYU and the sponsoring departments for supporting this panel. Before I begin, I would like to take a moment to remember that our migrant histories traverse the legacy of displacement, erasure, and genocide of Indigenous people. I would like to acknowledge the Tongva people as the past, present, and future stewards in the land on which I currently live, as well as the Lokono people on whose land my grandfather built our family home. Omar, if you wouldn't mind advancing, the first slide on mine is our home. As farmers, and before that, plantation laborers, my ancestors developed a particular relationship to the land as a source of agency and survival. Birthed from the bellies of ships as either enslaved people or indentured laborers, the land under colonial extraction was both prison and liberator. The seasons of planting and reaping that stretch out between those ancestors and me have swallowed up so much that can never be regained. My artwork and text published in Liminal Spaces speak to this erasure, this loss. They are an elegy to the fragments that remain and the blank spaces that can only exist as fiction. A lot has changed in the world and in me since I created this work over 5 years ago, and I struggle to contextualize this loss amidst the ongoing, intersecting global traumas we are now currently living through. Perhaps I can draw an uncertain line between Ramsuki, my grandmother's grandmother, kidnapped as a young girl and sold into indenture, never to see her family again, and the children separated from their parents at the US-Mexico border, perhaps never to be reunited again. What I know is that Ramsuki's loss is also my loss, just as the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of today's atrocities will hold this trauma in their bodies like a stone. So perhaps even as I talk about the past, I'm also talking about the future, about what can be salvaged in the world after apocalypse. Omar, if you could go to the next slide, thanks. I'd like to share a few fragments from my chapter titled Keeping Wake, which traces my experiences returning to Guyana as an adult and the passing of my grandmother. A savage womb. Each wave, the sickness spreads. Fear eats at her body. With each mile, she is not herself. There is a new kinship. Awake, the scent of home, damp earth, smoky blankets, splintered stone, fades from her skin, replaced by blood, sweat, and bile. Licked clean. Only after would come the sugarcane fields, watered with sweat, and the sweet intoxication as, distilled, it burned warm in her chest. All she wants to do is be a cannibal, spit up a new history, never die. She wants to be told. Could we go to the next slide? Kalpani. They called the sea Kalpani, black water. They said if you crossed it, you lost caste. You became forever severed from your life, from the land. I often wonder what they must have thought, emerging from the tomb-like ships to a land with such unctuous rivers, rivers that on certain still evenings take on the quality of black glass, a river of ink, Kalpani. Blood is mostly water, a means of transporting oxygen and nutrients around the body. It's strange that for some people it's transferable, shareable, and for others it's more particular, a mechanism and a fingerprint, Lalpani. Uncle tells me the river changes course with the tides. The land breathes like a lung. Could we go to the next slide? I think of Nanny's brain, the flood of Lalpani from a ruptured aneurysm. I think of the mysteries locked in our blood, the stories of our bodies permeating her brain. Maybe for a moment before she lost consciousness, she got some insight, some answer that can only be found in water. They flood the fields in the planting season. I wonder how we came up with the concept of parallel lines, of corners. Why do we so naturally lean towards this type of efficiency? Nature is efficient in a completely different kind of way, a way that seems infinite and nonlinear. Squares lead to fields, lead to blocks, lead to buildings, lead to temples, lead to hierarchy and history and war. Curved lines don't really lead anywhere, except they are blood cells and bubbles and planets. Next slide, please. Thalassa, the sea, hema, blood. Thalassemia, sea blood. Walcott said the sea is history. My blood is sea blood. My blood is fractured, thrown outside of time. How to live from one moment to the next is a question I can't answer, just as I don't know if you can step in the same river twice. Nanny asked that we build her tomb high above the ground so the flooding river would not touch her body. In India, they cremate the remains and submerge the ashes in the Ganges. Embrace the void or embrace the land. In between is life. Thanks.
I think we all need a minute to gather our thoughts. That was deep, to say the least, very moving. And we're a little bit, we have a little bit of time to talk amongst ourselves about some of the points that you've made. I just had a couple of observations that I thought maybe you could speak to a little more before we turn it over. And one is that, you know, as I'm listening to you, each of you give your presentations, it really becomes so apparent that there is one of the things that most, it seems to me, characterizes diaspora, if I can put it this way, is contradiction. Because on the one hand, you have the simultaneity of alienation and belonging, right? You have the objects, including photographs and other objects that have stories that are, who convey, that stories that convey their material value, but also their very evanescent and certainly affective as an emotion value. That's another kind of contrast. I was thinking about what you were saying in various ways about, you know, those that are left behind, and you know, why do we and it's quite true that those that are left behind are treated almost as remnants. And that gets exacerbated, I think, when certainly Guyana and also there are other countries in the Americas that fit this description. I think Belize, don't quote me, but where people in country are fewer than those in their various diasporas. And so we have this kind of, you know, looking back at those remnants, so to speak, at home, but at the same time, those remnants have so much weight, so much symbolic weight. It's almost as if we strive for belonging through reaching back to this past. This belonging in the present really is predicated on what we can excavate from this past. And in the Guyana example, a much smaller percentage demographically, but culturally looming very large. I mean, it's interesting that you touched on the role of India in these this imaginary or these imaginaries, and I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that in your work, if you will, but also just to finish this thought that, you know, again, the expectations of those left at home are, in a way, what makes the journey away only complete upon return, in some sense. if that makes sense. That there's, you know, again, this kind of contrast or contradiction between our sense of self in the moment or in the now really becomes something that hinges on what we can excavate from these remnants in the past. And that was a kind of through line through all of your comments, I think, and your reflections about your work. So given that, those kinds of contradictions between, you know, the material and the immaterial meaning, you know, not irrelevant, but kind of not corporeal, right? And the contradiction between, you know, belonging and alienation, and yet belonging in some sense being, you know, hooked onto a past that has been alienated or snatched away. And, you know, the journey really depending on what one can resuscitate or excavate from what has been left behind, that this looms so large in the present. And I wondered if you think, if you think I'm completely rambling and crazy, or, and if not, then do you think this is an inevitable aspect of diaspora? I'll ask you, you know, Guyana, or if you want to make a reference point to the Atlantic world or to the diaspora in North Atlantic and North American contexts, you know, or this sort of tension, and not only in a negative sense. I wondered if you thought that this is this the inevitable takeaway that we seem to always light on, myself included, as I think, and by the way, you know, this is not is not my part of the world for my genealogy, but I certainly understand the commonalities and what you're saying for the new world as an old world person. And so I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about how, if you think these kinds of tensions or contradictions characterize diasporas, however you want to trace the lines, and if you think that there might be other ways to think through diaspora, and then also does India fall anywhere in here? Because certainly today among Guyanese communities in the North Atlantic and North American context, India has a very interesting role in the imaginary. So there's just a kind of smorgasbord, jump in wherever that strikes you. And then, you know, I'll stop and we can turn to you. Thank you.
So I can speak to the role of India maybe in the imaginary in my family maybe. So, you know, I grew up Hindu, but a version of Hinduism that was maybe from the, you know, mid 1900s, right? I mean, 1800s, from when my family first came over. And when I was younger, you know, growing up in different areas, but especially in New Jersey, where there's a large South Asian community, you know, the South Asians didn't really see us as South Asian, as Indian. You know, we had left 2 generations before. We didn't speak the language, you know, and even though we ate similar foods or had, you know, watched Bollywood film or whatever it was, we weren't accepted as such. And I think for me, years later, you know, going to India, you know, I have a master's in South Asian art. I decided, you know, I wanted to learn more about South Asian art. You know, it was all these steps to sort of become authentic in some way, or find this homeland, or find authenticity in what I thought was, you know, as a way of belonging, I guess. And so I think India does play a significant role in my family's imagination, for sure.
Yeah, you know, I really resonate with that. You know, I didn't major in South Asian art history, but I definitely had like a very strong attraction to it, and it's definitely a a big part of my aesthetic references. And, you know, I also was trying to drag my mother to various archaeological sites when we went back to India together when I was in college. And, you know, and I studied Hindi in college, and, you know, trying to sort of reconnect with this. But then there is also this tension of, you know, I often think about like the judges and administrators who allowed my grandmother's grandmother to be put on a boat when she was 10 years old, and pretending like that was a choice that she was making and not being forced, and kind of the failures of that culture to see my ancestors as valuable and worth keeping, and instead seeing them as labor that was worth exporting. And also, you know, the rupture that's created with this, you know, like the power structures of caste and like that kind of violence, which, you know, didn't really operate the same way in Guyana, and the idea that, you know, you'd have to do these elaborate ceremonies to sort of regain caste if you were going to go back. And so, as much as, you know, I love this heritage and it's so important to me, there is this sort of tension of, you know, like my ancestors were not seen as like fully part of that society to begin with, you know, and so when I take these things on, it is with that critical eye of, you know, as much as I feel empowered by some of these aesthetics, it's also like, you know, were my ancestors the ones getting like hot oil poured in their ears for like listening to the sutras being recited, you know, like where on this scale of power were they? So yeah, I think I don't know if it's intrinsic in that everyone thinks that way, but I definitely, you know, resonate with these very complicated, you know, relationships, especially to Indianness.
I wanted to say, really, in answer to that question, I feel myself to be really rooted in this idea of a indentured labor diaspora, and I feel kind of a strong connection, and that's been solidified by an anthology I worked on, which was a collection of writing by people from across the indentured labor diaspora, and I feel that's where my identity as it relates to my dad, because I'm a person of dual heritage, that's firmly where I sit. I sit as a member of that diaspora, and I have a great curiosity and a strong connection with communities in Mauritius and South Africa and Fiji, and that for me, I have to say I felt a stronger sense of homecoming in going to Mauritius than I did when I went to India, and, you know, seeing things there like the Kali Mai Puja, and the way people reacted to my research, because I was doing my PhD at the time. So yeah, that's I kind of look around and not back to India. Not to say that I don't acknowledge it as part of my identity, I do, but it's perhaps not as strong as I might have thought it would be, kind of having made that journey of familial research and knowing where my dad's great grandparents came from in India.
That makes me just want to follow up for a second on what you just said, Maria, because you said you kind of see yourself anchored in a specifically indentured labor kind of diaspora, or the genesis of that, and that sort of was a nice segue to my last question, and that is, do you know, for all of these kinds of expressions of attachment and detachment, I mean, maybe that's a general rubric of the contradiction that we can hear over and over again in Indo-Caribbean and also just West Indian diasporas. It's this constant oscillation and mutually constitutive relationship between detachment and reattachment. But do you see these, any of you, in more cultural terms through your art, whether it's written or other kinds, or visual, or do you see them, would you characterize these relationships in political terms, or do you see no difference? They're kind of a seamless whole? Because, you know, again, Maria, you brought in specifically, you know, I'm the coolie diaspora, to quote Bahadur, right? And I'm wondering, do you think you're in your work, all of you, whatever medium you engage or media you engage in, do you think that politics speaks for itself, the politics of diaspora, however you envision them, or do you think they have a separate place and way to be expressed or showcased? Politics, culture, how do they live together in your art?
So yes, I think they do, especially in the last 5 years or so. I've very much delved into the research of indentured labor. I did an exhibition entitled Sugarbound, where all the work, you know, was in some way related to labor around sugar. So yes, very much. I think I'm not an activist artist per se, but I feel that all of my work alludes to this idea of my history, my family's history of indentured labor. And I definitely don't shy away from that material.
I'm purposefully quiet because I'm really enjoying listening to them talk about the work, because for so long we were just on the page, you know, we were just working on the page in Google Docs, and so I'm a bit kind of feasting on hearing Maya and Maria and Suchitra talk about their work. So that's why I'm kind of not responding. But Omar is signaling us that there are questions in the chat if we want to go to, and the Q&A section if we want to.
Absolutely, yeah. I just did not want to cut anybody off, and maybe someone had, you know, and also it's a selfishness on my part. I wonder, you know, why am I not feeling these things, or, you know, how do I feel them in different ways? So it's, I thank you for your contributions to those, you know, selfish questions that others, I'm sure, listening have also. So we have a Q&A here. And let me say that we have questions. Someone is curious about saying that the stories are mostly from an Indo-Guyanese point of view, and they would like to know if all of the coverage of the book focuses on Indo-Guyanese. And then another person is asking if other young women might be a part of the panel, I'm assuming at a later date. And there's a question for me, but I think we'll focus on those two questions for you first. That's more important.
First one quickly, and then there's some in the chat too that I.
Okay, good.
Great. So yes, so tonight we were invited by the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and the Asian Pacific Institute, and also the Center for Black Visual Culture, to speak, as we shared earlier at the opening of the program, just about this one thread in the book, which is the art of adventure and the Indo-Guyanese migration narratives within the book. It is just a very small section of the book. The book itself is far and wide in terms of the contributors and their narratives and art in the book. And I'm putting the link to the full book again in the chat for everyone. And there was a great question by Gabrielle Hussein. Aisha, I don't know if you see that question in the chat. I can read it.
I didn't move forward because I thought if you wanted to answer the other question that I raised, but absolutely, I can just go through all of these if you like. I don't know how many you want as a group or one at a time. We have some time. Do you there's a I don't know how you want to do this, Grace. Do you want to look through and see which ones seem most pertinent? Lots of people are congratulating you. Lots of people are excited about the book. People basically want to hear more from more contributors, which is very exciting for you all. There's a question, I think it's an easy one to grasp. Someone is asking, where are all of you now? Meaning, has this moment changed anything for you and your engagement with yourself and the world?
I think Maya, was it Maya who was saying earlier on that these pieces are from 4 or 5 years ago? Well, Maya, I'm in a similar situation, and I was actually editing while I was reading because my mum is Spanish, and I wrote in this that part of the reason I felt so isolated growing up is because neither of my parents passed on a cultural identity. My mum was born in the Spanish Civil War. She grew up under a dictatorship. And that very much affected how she wanted to remember Spain. And there's a part there where I was saying that I don't speak Spanish. And for that reason, I couldn't connect with Spain. And that's changed tremendously now for me because I started learning 3 years ago. And I kind of, when we were answering that last question, Aisha, I was thinking often for children of dual heritage, how you feel about your identity and how you relate to the world. Well, I think for all of us, but perhaps there's that stronger sense in children of dual heritage that you're on a journey and nothing is fixed. And I think my mum died last year. And in the last kind of 2 or 3 years, so even before she died, I had a chance to go to Spain, and it affected a lot how I felt about who I was, because I was saying in that piece that I always felt like I must be my dad's daughter because nobody racially abused us because our mum was white with fair hair and blue eyes. Everything that we experienced as kids came from the fact that our dad was identified as an Indian man. And so a lot has changed for me, I guess, in terms of how I see myself and how comfortable I feel in the world, and how I perceive my identity. So looking back, I didn't want to change it too much, because I feel it's a record of who you were at the time that you wrote it. But there was a sense of not wanting to be authentic about who I am now and who I was then.
That's Alan asking that question. Alan, thank you so much for that beautiful question. This question of, has this moment changed anything for you in your engagement with yourself and the world? I think when you leave as a child, when you leave a place as a child, I left as a teenager, so teenager, it requires so much to leave. And so you end up spending your time in the new country just adjusting and assimilating and all of those highly traumatic things. And I think for me, not until I was an adult and I began to find myself in other places, I would see Guyana in those places. And instead of feeling like an American in these places, which is where I've lived most of my life, more than Guyana, I felt Guyanese. in these places. So in Italy, I'm not American, I'm Guyanese. In Ethiopia, I'm Guyanese. In India, I'm Guyanese. I'm not American. And what struck me, to your question, Alan, what struck me was how in adulthood, Guyana shaped my life more powerfully than when I was younger. And I don't have an answer as to why that is. I think all of that goes back to the question we're all trying to answer together in this book, is how to examine and negotiate this liminal space. But that I feel more connected to Guyana as I travel the world. You know, that I see Guyana in Italy more than I see sometimes Guyana in Guyana, which is quite, you know, ironic. But that has really been an interesting thing for me to see occur and shift.
You know, and I mentioned that, like, I had changed a lot, and, you know, my relationship to a lot of the ideas that I was talking about changed a lot. But also, like, this, when I received, like, the PDF of this book from Grace, like, I think as some of the other, you know, panelists mentioned, like, there was this sense of community, because I think, especially me, I've always kind of like been sort of like this little like dot of like this person that, you know, like racially ambiguous. We don't know what you are. We don't know where you're from. And when you explain it to us, we still don't understand. And, you know, like I never lived in New York or Toronto or any of these like big Guyanese communities. So I always felt like very detached. And so I appreciate Grace for bringing me into, you know, previous projects where, you know, my work was with other Guyanese artists, but I couldn't be there physically. And so to have the book, it's like, if like, I guess now that we're like existing in this like virtual space, it is like I'm in a space with all of these other artists and writers and thinkers. And I feel like that also has been like a change for me, because I think, you know, and Maria, like reading your book, when I got to the part, oh, sorry, not your book, your chapter, when I got to the part where you said that you hadn't had pepper pot as a child, and not realizing like that, you know, that like I did have these Guyanese experiences, even though I didn't feel always 100% Guyanese. And yeah, and so it's like all of these connections and threads are helping me sort of re-see my identity in this moment, which has been like a very special experience. So, you know, I've changed, but also this book that has shown up in my life has also changed me. So thanks.
We have a couple of questions that can be combined. One from Joan, who's asking about if did the collecting of these images and objects and the stories they reveal, were some of these, did these stories and the collecting of them lead you to unexpected places? And then Gabby says, congratulations, and then wants to know, and this is a kind of a corollary, how do you reflect on what can be captured and what cannot be captured in your work? So it's unexpected places where that you may have been taken to, and maybe one of those unexpected places was you can't capture what you're seeking, but obviously you captured a lot.
Well, curatorially, you know, and so this required me to have two hats, editor and curator. And the women that have been invited into this project initially were women who I've worked with in previous, you know, curatorial projects or other projects, and was just blown away and really moved by their work. And so I did come in saying, I love this body of work. Can you expand and write about this body of work? But what really blew me away, to the earlier point about our family albums and getting permission about photographs, was how each and every one of these contributors just generously opened up their own family archives and their family albums. And so we've got scans of letters in this book written in the 1970s. We've got, you know, passport photos like Maria's photos. We've just got so much intimate information that went beyond the art of migration, the public things that have been made visible. And I was really struck and moved by how all of them opened up their lives and their family archives and put those images and those letters and those stories into this project. So that was a beautiful, unexpected gift.
And we have more questions. Let's see. I'm juggling two different sites here. Another really interesting question is if you all might share your thoughts on any, as this question puts it, dream projects that you may be considering in your work.
I'm working on something at the moment which is quite pertinent, I think, to my experience. So Maya was talking before about my dad not kind of including anything Guyanese or making reference to anything related to his heritage when we were growing up, and that is a very powerful erasure to grow up under, particularly when it's both your parents. And so one of the things that I'm working on at the moment is a project called The Other Windrush, which is about collecting the stories of people like me, who are descendants of Chinese and Indian indentured laborers to the Caribbean, who were also part of the Windrush generation in the UK and are not seen or identified as such. And so I'm working on a book which is a collection of essays by that community, which is a real joy for me, because I think just when Maya was speaking, then I was thinking about what my dad chose to do and how he chose to bring us up, not in reference to his culture, his heritage, and I was thinking that what I have done as an adult is really kind of pick up these pieces that he has cast off and take them back to him and say, you know, this thing that you thought is worth nothing is actually worth everything, you know. And I think kind of that for me is the most important project I'm working on, and it feels kind of like the culmination of my journey and my dad's journey, and so that's something that I'm enjoying at the moment.
This is actually a response to the previous question about sort of the liminal space, what's unsaid, I guess. And for me, in my work, I think the space of myth becomes the sort of space where what can't be said occupies. And I'm not sure how to best convey that, but it's through the artwork. There's often, you know, when I think of the past, when I think of Guyana, there's so much memory that one can, you know, you can look through your photographs, you can find images, you can look through, you know, the annals, you can look through old historic prints, but that liminal space, you know, that space where there's something unsaid, I think for me, you know, in my work, it comes out as myth. So.
Yeah, if I could just hop in on that previous, I feel like I just needed like a little time to like process that question. But I feel like I'm just constantly just like referencing Maria's chapter. I apologize, but I just saw so many parallels, I think, because, you know, we both have this like mixed race background. But we both like went to the Guyana archives looking for something and not getting what we needed. And for me, what ended up happening was that what I needed was in the oral histories of my family. or like what kind of filled in like this missing information that like I couldn't really ever get anymore because like what I needed was missing from the archives. But then also thinking about what Suchitra was saying about myth is that you ask a family member a story about something that happened even when everybody was alive, and you get, you know, I have 11 aunts and uncles, and you'd probably get, so with my mom, 12 different stories about one event. And then there'd be a big argument about who was right and who was wrong. And so you see how, you know, that the history becomes a reflection of the person telling it. And so a lot of this work that I created actually came from interviewing my mother and my grandmother and noticing like these kind of gaps between their perceptions of similar things, and then also that I existed in that relationship too. And so I think it's sort of an interesting project because we I don't know, we want to believe that there is like a truth, but in a way, because we don't have like archives of our families, there can, like, the truth is always this thing that just like exists in different ways in different people's bodies and lives. And so I think that there's like a potential for in that uncertainty, which I don't know, maybe is, you know, can tell us something about our current levels of uncertainty and how to sit with contradiction. And yeah, I don't know, my reaction.
There's a trick to not to finding that window where we can move on, or if we're still ruminating. But as you have shown, we can always go back to questions. Here's a kind of interesting one that is asking if each of you on the panel, is your art and the process of producing art a space that liberates you from a tension of alienation and belonging, you know, I guess that we had spoken about earlier, or is your art a space to encounter and confront a sense of liminality, or both?
I could say I really see what I'm doing now as an act of resistance to what my parents did, and I don't mean that in a way that is hostile to them. But I see my life now very much as I said, as picking up the pieces of. There's a writer I reference, a British Guyanese writer I reference in my piece, who was really fundamental in bringing me to Indian Caribbean literature as a source of study. And I heard him say, either in an interview or in a television program, or I read it in an interview, he said that Guyanese people flirt with the things that should not be said. And I kind of think the older I get, the more I think, you know, let's not flirt with the things that should not be said. Let's just say them, you know. And I spent so much of my childhood and my youth being told by my parents that we shouldn't talk. I mean, I referenced before that my mum grew up under a dictatorship, and that's not something you kind of cut off from, you know, that you shouldn't talk about this, you shouldn't talk about that, where we're from doesn't matter. And I think that there were so many layers of silence now. And I at the time, I thought I really trusted my parents' perception that they must be right about these things, that the only way to identify in Britain was to be British. And I feel now that that acting contrary to how they advise me is a really beautiful thing, because I keep putting these stories out into the world, and I feel, I don't know what it's like to read them, but writing them, I feel great. I feel this sense of release, of saying, you know, nothing terrible is going to happen if we speak about the tragedies, and something wonderful that might happen is we may reach somebody else which is what happened to me in this chapter, reading the work of an Indian Guyanese writer. We may reach somebody else who needs to hear them. So that would be my answer to the question.
Yeah, I think my answer would be both. You know, I think that the work that I have in this book, I think it did sit more in the contradictions and maybe sat in the trauma a lot. And I think more recently, I've been trying to find a way to sort of weave together all these contradictions and, you know, and sort of form like resistance to, you know, kind of the structural violence that I see around me. So rather than kind of just, you know, I used to say, like, you know, you have to, like, the wound has to be acknowledged in order for it to be healed. You can't just like pretend that it's not there. But, you know, I feel like I moved through this phase of wound acknowledgement for a very long time. And now I'm trying to like imagine, I'm trying to take the pieces that, you know, were my, were kind of inherited from this story that I can see as making me powerful, and making my community powerful and our perspectives powerful. And so I think that, you know, I can't remember like the exact phrasing of it, but you know, that it's like the weaving together of all of these things that initially were like ruptures and contradictions. I guess I can't remember the word. It's not like transcendence. It's like when you like bring different materials together to make like a new material. That's kind of how I'm thinking about it.
I think our book itself, if we are to think of the physical book as an art object, as a work of art, if I may be so bold, I think the fact that it's in the world is definitely, to use your words, Maria, an act of resistance and an act of confrontation. Because, and Aisha, I'm sure you're familiar with, you know, the trials of publishing and the publishing world, but to get a publisher to see the value in a book about Guyanese women, solely by Guyanese women, was a battle. It was a 5-year battle. And Maria knows a little bit of some of that backstory, and to the amount of defense and almost, you know, writing a dissertation as to why a project like this, not only bringing together Guyanese women to talk about Guyanese women experiences, but to actually root it in something so urgent and contemporary and meets the moment that we're in, which is this universal 21st century experience of migration. And to offer that and to fight for that was a really, really difficult challenge. So the fact that the book itself is in the world, and on top of that, I see someone is asking a question about making the book open access. To make the book, you know, an open access edition, a PDF and the HTML version, freely accessible to anyone that wants to read it, meaning this is not a monetary, you know, project. This is really a democratic project, if I might use that word. That in itself was another challenge. But the fact that the book is in the world, that it's the first of its kind to be authored by entirely all Guyanese women, about Guyanese women, I think is a feat in itself in terms of how we resist and confront the absence of our stories and the silencing of our stories.
Well, may I segue to an interesting question? Again, since, you know, one of the things I think the anthology does is show how varied are the ways to identify as Guyanese or as Guyanese women. You know, so the question becomes, you know, with all of these varieties of experiences and personal heritages and various, you know, angles of entry, what makes you all identify as Guyanese in the light of all of these differences. And then, so this question I think is interesting, where the person says, as individuals of, and it's for all of you, as individuals of diaspora, are there any feelings of authenticity between oneself and the country away from one's home? And I think it's another way of sort of thinking about this feeling of authenticity and what makes you Guyanese and what is that glue. And yet, you know, in the face of all of these variety of ways of being. His question or her question was about authenticity.
Yeah, I mean, I think I really struggled with that, you know, growing up. I feel like, especially, you know, my family would sometimes tease me for being the white girl of the family. But I think being in this book and seeing how deeply connected a lot of things that I'm thinking about and doing are connected to all these other women, you know, I feel like really helped me realize that, you know, I'm just my little different self in my family, but there are other people who, you know, are also little weird artists and creative people and writers. And that, you know, we don't all need to be, you know, like business majors or all the other stereotypically Guyanese occupations that we, you know, that as children of immigrants, you're kind of expected to be. So yeah, I think when I was younger, it was very difficult, you know. And then of course that, like, I grew up here, and you know, I had all these, you know, I was like so privileged to be in America. You know, I didn't have to like walk barefoot to school or whatever, you know, the stories were. But I think as I've grown older and been able to kind of have this like wider scope and to kind of unearth these ways in which I am deeply connected to this identity. And then I think also like the death of my grandmother, like that I kind of talk about in the book, sort of reinforced that realization that that like those things are there, even if they weren't super apparent to me on the surface.
I think ultimately the idea of authenticity is really, you know, it's really about family, right? How you connect to family and through stories and through biography and, you know, I think we often internalize or think about authenticity in terms of other people's estimation of us. But I think we all have connected stories and experiences, and that's what brings us together. I mean, in my opinion, about authenticity. So.
I mean, that's a really difficult question for me. I mean, I kind of unthinkingly am loyal to to a country that I have really quite flimsy connections with. If you think about it, I wasn't born there like Grace. I didn't grow up there, but I just feel this immense sense that it gave me my dad, and my dad is everything to me, you know. And I feel that. So, for example, I was part of a team that organised the last Guyana Awards in the UK. And it was a massive project. It was hours and hours of kind of unpaid labour, because you volunteer to do it. And I was really happy. I was really happy to do it. I have a little boy, so it was very hard to organise childcare. But I did it so unthinkingly. When they asked me, I was like, wow, this is what an honour, you know, to have a call from the High Commission of my dad's country to come and I'm really precious about my time because I have a little boy, and also because I work. But it wasn't something that it wasn't something that I questioned. I feel a strong sense of owing something to the place that gave me this man who kind of was so fundamental in informing me. And I say that kind of aware that I've also said that he never really spoke about Guyana, but I think you'll see in my piece that I dragged him. I dragged him back there eventually.
We have a beautiful section that opens up Liminal Spaces, part 1, called Mothering Lands. And what's really unique about that section is that all of the contributors are not born in Guyana, not a single one of them, but their mothers are and their grandmothers are. And so the whole section of that part of the book, Mothering Lands, is how they view their mothers as a metaphor for Guyana, and how their connection and their identity of being Guyanese is not true through the actual physical place, but it's through a person, a singular person, their mothers. And it's also a really beautiful part of the book too, because it examines what happens when we lose our mothers, and our mothers are our strongest connection to this place. And how do we begin to reconcile and negotiate both the loss of mother and motherland? And so to your point, Maria, about, not being born there, but what we capture in the book are some beautiful stories of, outside of being physically birthed on that soil, how our connections to this country is still very much rooted to our mothers and their mothers and fathers.
Can I say quickly, guys? I was explaining to my son the other day something that I found quite interesting and different about his grandparents. And I was saying in Guyana, I don't think he would be automatically accepted as being Guyanese in the same way that if you're in Spain and you say that your mother's Spanish, you're Spanish. That would never be questioned. And I love the way that there's almost a very sense, this is an exclusive club, and just because your dad's Guyanese, Maria, it doesn't mean that you can kind of come in. So I'm always very careful to say my dad is Guyanese, but I was born in the UK. But I love that kind of almost like a test. I remember meeting a bouncer at a club when I was in my 20s. My husband and I were going to a club in South London, and I remember the bouncer saying to us, he was from Essequibo, and he said to us, how can she be Guyanese? Because my husband had got talking to him, I have to let us in. And he said, how can she be Guyanese? She doesn't even speak Guyanese. And it was such a nice rejection because it makes you think, well, I'm gonna have to work for this part of my identity.
Yeah.
I wanted to add something, which is that this book is so important in terms of belonging, right? And in terms of bringing us all together. But as a microcosm, right? I hope that it speaks to other people who have migrated under different circumstances, right? I mean, I think ultimately, for me, when I make art, it's really, you tell one story that you're familiar with in order to somehow speak to something universal. And that, for me, my hope in, being part of the project is that it touches on themes and stories that are both particular and universal. So, yeah.
Well, I want to say that we're a little bit over time. I know we could go on for, there's many more questions, and that's always a good sign when you have more questions than you can possibly answer in the time allotted. So I thought maybe just for the next minute or so, if Grace or anybody on the panel would like to have a little, you've sort of started doing it already, maybe a little bit of a summing up. Before we, have to continue with our evenings.
I'll do a quick closing. First of all, Aisha, thank you so much for guiding us through this conversation. And again, I'm still beaming from those words of your introduction. It's so beautiful. Thank you so much. And to Maria, who it's now way past bedtime, it's midnight in London. Thank you, and Suchitra and Maya on the West Coast. Thank you all so much for your generosity. And just to acknowledge the additional incredible contributors in the book, I'd like to name them. Some of them are here in our audience. I see you all. Thank you so much. And that's Khadija Ben, Sandra Brewster, Erica DeFreitas, Ingrid Griffith, Natalie Hopkinson, Serena Hopkinson, hi Serena, Dominique Hunter, Christy Neptune, Grace Nichols, Keisha Scarville, and I know Michelle Joan Wilkinson was also joining us tonight. So thank you all so much. Thank you to the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, APA, Center for Black Visual. Just thank you. It took a lot of thank yous and gratitude to get this project into the world. So I'm overwhelmed with gratitude. And that is what I'd like to say as a closing remark. I think Omar is signaling us to wrap up. Is that what you're saying, Omar, and say goodnight?
Well, I think it's time. Thank you very much for the privilege of being here. I actually didn't get a chance to tell you the very interesting question that was sent to me. We'll talk about it another time, but let me underscore the privilege it was for me to be here, since part of the question was, you know, why me? So we should talk about that another time. And thank you so much, and the best of luck. This book is going to go like wildfire. It's very clear from everybody's comments and excitement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Aisha.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.